of apartments, selling for 1.2, 1.3, and that's, or 1.5 million. That's the sort of the disparity that we're talking about. It's not so much about, apartments work everywhere, or apartments don't work everywhere, or units work everywhere, or units don't work everywhere. And that's why a lot of investors tend to shy away from it, because they're like, I don't know, what's the preferred asset type for this suburb?
There are other places, right? Good investment grade suburbs all across Australia. And I feel that there are other options. There are other options there.
Naturally for people to buy an apartment or the demand to be there, the supply needs to be crunched for people to basically go there and push the prices up. You're listening to Help Me Buy Property podcast, powered by Investor Partner Group. We help improve lifestyles by building scalable and sustainable generational wealth and passive income streams. We do this via our ecosystem that is a one-stop shop to all property investment needs, from evidence-based, data-driven buyers agency, industry-renowned portfolio reviews and property strategies, property development with and for clients, tax, SMSF, business structures advisory, and cash flow real estate. Everything we do is to help people achieve financial independence and not just basic financial freedom by using property as a tool and as a medium. Presently, we've launched Australian Property Academy, where we are training and teaching buyers agents, property advisors, property strategic partners, and secrets to finding investor-grade properties to astute investors. Connect now to experience it yourself, or drop in a line below at info@helpmebuy.com.au to get more information. Be kind and happy investing. Today is an interesting topic, and we are talking about buying units versus houses. It's a very up and trendy topic. And we'll talk about
everyone's just and
people hearing it from a mouth, should we be buying units or houses or townhouses? It's quite funny. But is it fair to buy units at $150,000, with great rental yield? And we'll talk a bit about that. Cheryl, what do you think? Let's open the floor. Let's go jump right into it.
When we brought this up, I was just like, it's going to be a really short episode. But obviously you raise a good point. And a lot of people do go, that's all I can afford right now in this area, in a good area. So let's not poo-poo units and apartments just as yet. People have made good money from.
And for a difference, I'm going to play the devil's advocate here and think Cheryl hates apartments and units, and I'm going to play the devil's advocate here.
I do hate it. My first property was an apartment, and it did well. We did some renovations, and we made some money from it. So it's not all that bad, and there's good strategies.
Definitely.
But I look at it now, and like there are some units where I think it's good to buy because there's scarcity. Right. So let's dive into that. They're not my product. However, there's a place.
And we are going to break this episode into two parts. So we are going to define units into two parts. One is apartments and one is townhouses, like houses with land or land attached to it, and then apartments. And we'll talk about apartments in a lot more detail. It's probably like part 2 of the episode. I think part 1, let's focus on units and houses with land, or units on 4 units in a block, and you're buying one of those townhouses typically. And that's where the focus. Let's talk a bit about that, because there is a bit of stereotype around those as well, that people don't like community title, townhouses, etc., because they feel that, these don't grow in value. So typically, let's start there.
Like, which one are we going to start? Are we going to start with apartments to begin with? What's our definition of apartment?
The definition of the apartment is there is no land attached to a single place. And the land is basically there, but you can't dictate how the piece of the land associated with you, right? So, whereas when you talk about typical townhouses or single units on multiple blocks, you have land associated with it. Yes, it's a small land, maybe 200 or 300 squares, but there's some sort of land component attached to it. If you look at the hierarchy, right, at the top of the food chain, you have houses with big lands, or massive land component. Then you have houses with smaller lands, and then you have units where there is really, really tiny lands or townhouses. And then you have apartments where there is literally no land available. And so that's typically the hierarchy that I look at in the residential sense.
Okay. So do we start off with the apartments with no land, which is effectively part of your
let's do that.
strata build.
Let's start there.
And then I guess what the thing we need to look at is, okay, well, say you've got apartments and it's a large scale, or then you might have like boutique style as well. So we can kick off with going, well, when is it a good idea to consider apartments?
When?
And then we'll go straight into why it's not a good idea.
I can't think of a reason. Is there a reason?
There is. Okay. Did you? I'm gonna play the good guy, and you can play.
Yeah, I'm always the bad cop.
I'll be cop to be. So good cop. When is a good idea? Is when it's in a boutique.
Okay.
Apartment.
How do you define boutique?
And that boutique I would say under 10 units, and you may disagree, but this is under 10 units. If you can add value to it. And if it's in a fantastic location, obviously it's got good bones, whichever, and that it's not going to be like if you've got views. Obviously, if you've got views, then, some of the key things are location. So if it's got views, it's in a great location. Potentially you can add value to it as well. Even like add a room or, just do renovate. Like generally they're cosmetic renovations. You don't want to do structural renovations, because if you do, then you have to go through your strata committee and all that. But in really, really good locations where you potentially can get good uplifts from the renovations, then I think it's worth looking at units in that regard.
And very interesting. I think all of those points that you talk about, I sort of agree.
Sort of.
Because there is one nuance to this as well. You can have the best location possible, but if there is an oversupply of apartments in those particular areas, then you would see those apartments do not grow in value no matter how boutique is that particular development. You look at areas like Docklands in Melbourne, or Chatswood in Sydney, or Box Hill in Melbourne. Like, typically there are so many apartments that are coming through that, there is typically an oversupply. And so while your development might be boutique in its own, there is so many happening at the same. Parramatta is again another example, right? You would never see the apartments truly growing up in value, primarily because of the wider supply versus demand. And so there is one extra element that I have always seen triggering when it comes to apartments. And, naturally for people to buy an apartment or the demand to be there, the supply needs to be crunched for people to basically go there and push the prices up. You see areas like Bondi where the apartments go up, or not sure where the apartments go up quite well, right? And those are the areas where the demand is significantly higher than supply and the price discrepancy is massive. You have house which is selling for like $10 million and you have apartment, selling for 1.2, 1.3 and that's, or 1.5 million. That's the sort of the disparity that we're talking about, right? But school zones play a really big part in apartments. Like, people who are trying to enter into school zones, and if you have a boutique apartment, block in a school zone, then they would always typically do well, because people are with small young families, they'll basically come in, get the schools done for like, primary and then look for a bigger home in secondary. So I've seen them playing out quite well as well. But I always see this like, it's almost like a preferred property type for a suburb. You need to ensure what works in that particular suburb. It's not so much about, apartments work everywhere, or apartments don't work everywhere, or units work everywhere, or units don't work everywhere. And that's why a lot of investors tend to shy away from it, because they're like, I don't know what's the preferred asset type for this suburb, or I don't know if this is the perfect configuration of this suburb. And you're right. I've seen some of my clients who bought under market apartments right close to the beach, spent some money, got the renovation done, lifted the value up pretty much right away. So they got the bank valuation done, lifted the value right up, and then Airbnb the shit out of it, right? Amazing strategy. You make a shit ton of cash. Yeah. So like, I completely agree. I think, there is a strategy to play with when you talk about apartments as well.
Yeah. And then the consideration, I mean, we're talking about apartments as an investment. Okay. We're not necessarily talking about it as an owner-occupier play. In that regard, buy whatever. Yeah. Buy whatever you want. A lot of downsizers sell their place and then buy apartments because of more lifestyle factor. But as an investment, in general, I would say, unless you have a clear strategy like that, where you are doing an Airbnb, and it overcomes all, like, the yields are fantastic, that it negates all the other strata fees and all that aspect, because you may, you've got to weigh it up that generally the capital growth isn't as much as it is if you've got
it's a very
land.
cash flow strategy, and it's a very manufactured equity strategy when it comes to apartment. It's not so much the growth strategy. You would never hear people buying apartments purely from a growth perspective. So, and that's why a lot of first-time investors or even experienced investors to a certain extent shy away from it. But you see a lot of astute investors who know that cash flow is quite important, would basically go down that path, because you'd be like, oh, I'm buying this apartment for $170. I'll spend like $40,000 in renovation. I'll get the bank to value this at $400. And then I'll put Airbnb and get the tenants in there. And then I'll be raking like 50, 60,000.
Where are these deals, Moss? Are you hiding these deals from us?
I mean, I'm telling you, and this is the real deal I'm talking about. Yeah, I'm not even making this up. Yeah. And the reason being is that the bank, you're playing typically with the bank valuation, right? Yes, the apartment might not sell for 500 or 450 or 500. But what you're doing is you're extracting the equity out from a bank's perspective, because the banks are valuing it at that point, and you're using that equity to basically go back and fund something else, and you are managing that extra equity or the debt through higher cash flow. It's an amazing strategy to play. There is one more thing, and I know we were talking about this when we kicked off the podcast, is apartments and lifestyle choices. And a lot of people, like I've been meeting a lot of clients who live very close to city in Melbourne typically, right? And so they live in St. Kilda or they live in South Yarra. And they're like, look, we love the location and we don't want to, get out of this location. So, but I hate paying rent. The rents are going up, the rent or the owner keeps kicking me out, or the landlord keeps kicking us out. And so what do, right? Should you just go out and buy an apartment? And the default position as an investor, especially like a non-emotional investor, is like, no, don't be stupid. Why would you buy an apartment, right? But there is an interesting strategy at play here. So the government, especially as a first-time buyer, the government is offering you an opportunity to basically acquire the houses at 5% deposit. There's a new federal scheme coming in, and I've just heard about it. I haven't read it in detail, where apparently the federal government is coming in at 35%. And so you only still have to pay 5%. And so it's like 40% government owned and 60%, when the bank lending comes in. This is where it gets really, really interesting, okay? So let's assume that, the bank is coming in at 15%, you're only putting up 5%, and you buy an apartment to live in, and this apartment is, let's say, $400,000, okay? At $400,000, it's like chalk and cheese that you're basically paying to basically hold on to that apartment. It's like literally like all up maybe 20,000, because there is no stamp duty under like 650. And I'm just making up numbers, but let's go with that. And all you're doing is you're basically replacing your rent with mortgage, with the debt. Yes, of course, there is a debt. And, naturally people would question as to, you're using the debt and you're not smartly using the debt and you can catch more growth on it. And why are you giving this growth away to the government? But imagine if this split happens at 40 and 60 and you're paying only like 60% of the mortgage as rent. So basically your repayment is lower than your rent that you would be paying in some of these areas. And yes, you're giving away 40% of the ownership to the government, but we all know that apartments don't grow in value anyway. So the square root of zero is still zero. So the government is not going to get any growth out of this anyway. And it's a smart play. And so you can generate a lot of cash flow out of these too. Technically, if you're going out on holidays, if you're traveling, and some of these are coming in from Argentina and Spain, and they travel a lot and they love their traveling. And it's perfect. Like if you're going away for 4 months, again, Airbnb the place out. Or, you're traveling between, November and January, and all of that time, you can get like $200-300 per week or per day in rent in some of these areas, in some of these locations. So like you can offset the rent a lot, by doing this. And again, people will ask the question, you're exposing yourself to capital gains tax. Well, there is no capital gains tax because there is no growth. Yeah. So it's an amazing strategy to play.
But I mean, if the cash flow aspect is it and you're not looking at the growth.
Yes.
Not counting on
100%. It's a lifestyle choice, right? But so, what you're doing with the lifestyle choice is you're not significantly going negative, you're still creating the cash flow out of it. And in order to make that lifestyle choice, you're not coughing up a lot of money up front. A lot of people make these lifestyle choices by spending $300,000 and buying a $1.3 million house. And so that's not what you're doing. You're only spending like $35,000 to $40,000 to make a beautiful lifestyle. I would love to live in an apartment in the city overlooking the waters. I'm very minimalistic like this. And I know if my wife is hearing this, don't get yourself taken on a ride by property spookers, so-called property investment advisors, or buyer's agents who are selling house and land packages or off-the-plan properties or apartments. Get yourself a copy of this book called The Millennial's Guide to Property Investing. This book is not just for millennials. The title suggests, but it's actually the most advanced way of investing in property. This book will relate to your clients, your colleagues, and other business owners. There are so many property spookers out there who have come out of the woodwork over the last 3 to 5 years. And there is so much misinformation out there that I had to write a book about all the F-ups that people can actually avoid in order to be super successful in the property investment journey. Some of these are really easy to identify, but they are so costly to fix once these mistakes are made. So it's a short book. It's easy to read. It has a lot of stories. It has a lot of examples. And it is a true guide for people who wants to do it themselves. My name is Moxin Reza. This is my story, and a lot of you will relate to parts of this story if you're not born in the riches and if you're trying to build a property portfolio that can last generations and help you improve your lifestyle along the way. So I give you a chance to come out there and have a read. Be kind, stay safe, keep smiling, keep investing, and please do check out the book.
With how many people in your household?
Yes, probably we need 2 apartments probably. So
they'll have
yes,
to be
it has
the
to be the
penthouse.
penthouse. But then that defies the purpose then, right? Because if you're buying a penthouse, you might as well buy a house, right? So
okay. So let's talk about what some of the considerations. I'm going to go back to being bad cop, right? What are some of the considerations and why it's not a great idea to consider apartments? Because people still do, and they sort of go, it's what I can afford. And again, we're talking about investments. First of all, don't necessarily just look at your backyard or your city. So if you live in Sydney or you live in Melbourne, you think I can only afford an apartment in a 1-bedroom studio, which is $750,000. Like, if that's what you can borrow, please don't make it a studio apartment. 100%. Right in Haymarket, right? You've got an issue with oversupply. You've got an issue with the fact that, your $750,000 could probably be spent elsewhere with much, yes, yields. You probably get good yields, but it's the capital growth. And then when you resell, because there's so much stock, there's a real good likelihood that you might not get the price that you want. Then you probably won't get very good growth, but also it's harder to sell.
Definitely. And especially like the older the apartment gets, it's ridden with issues, right? So, God forbid if there is some issue with the building and it shows up on the sinking fund, then you are doomed. I have a client story where they bought something in Chatswood and the valuation has gone back. They probably bought it for like $850 or something, and they can't even sell it for $600 because everyone knows about that particular building and there is issues there, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And then you need to consider, yes, you've got strata fees and all sorts of things. You can claim that from tax, but then that affects your cash flow as well. So, that's why for a lot of people, apartments are not the first choice for most more, I'm not going to say experienced investors, but just be mindful when you're looking at that. Unless, like I said, you had a strategy similar where you're getting clear, I'm going to Airbnb, I'm going to renovate and add value.
And it's a risky asset class as well. If you're talking about the risks, like, picking up a house with a normal due diligence, I would say if you pick the right suburb, you're almost 75-80% there. If you pick the house in a right suburb, even if the house is old or new or whatever, right? If the land is there and the land is scarce, you could never typically go wrong if you pick the right suburb. Whereas in an apartment, you could pick the right suburb, but still see zero growth coming through in some of these areas because of the supply, because supply can come in so quickly in some of these areas.
In particular, if you have been sold something off the plan, and often, particularly if there's an oversupply, they might not stack up. There have been instances previously where people have bought off the plan and prices have gone up with apartments, and that's, that's great. And that happens with townhouses as well. But there have been many, many situations where if an apartment has been spooked by a property marketer, the valuations they'll come, they come in short, and then also the values drop as well, because then all these other places are building apartments also. So be very, very mindful.
And it's very sad as to a lot of these property spookers basically target people who are coming in from countries where apartments are very common and they grow in value, right? You talk about India, Hong Kong, Singapore, Malaysia, all of these areas, people naturally have lived their life. Even China to a certain extent, you talk about Beijing, right? Everyone has lived in an apartment. They've seen the apartment's value go up. But understand that the apartments go up there because the demand is through the roof. There is no active supply coming in because there is already so many apartments there, and people are still finding it harder and harder to basically buy there. So of course the value goes up. Australia is probably 30 or 40 years away from that cycle. So we need to be really careful, especially sometimes these first home buyers coming through. Don't think about just because it's in CBD, people would fall in love with apartments. Australia has this love for backyards. There is this love for land. Australians love big backyards. So, no matter sometimes how good the location is, if there is an oversupply, you would be penalized in 5 to 10 years' time, seeing no growth in some of these areas and opportunities.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's move on to townhouses then. How are they different or similar to apartments?
Yeah. See, townhouses, the important thing with townhouses typically is that there is a land component attached to it. So, and that land component typically has some sort of value, per square meter attached to it. The biggest difference is basically that land, and, typically the land value goes up. You would see that even being a small backyard or putting a double-story house there, people would feel comfortable buying some of these things, knowing that there would be not an oversupply to some of these things. As I said, as you start at the very start, right? Me as a family, we cannot live in a 3-bedroom apartment. It's impossible. Okay. But if you give me like a 4-bedroom townhouse, we could probably survive there. Probably. Yeah. Whereas the price difference might not be that much between the two. And so naturally, people default always to townhouses versus apartments, because you could have double story, you can have a bit of a bigger space to live in. And the price discrepancy between apartments, townhouses, and houses, you would usually see that apartments and townhouses are usually very closely priced. And you would see houses sitting way far. And Balcombe Hill is a typical example. I remember 2015-16, I was talking to this friend of mine. No, 2014-15, I was talking to this friend of mine, and I was there in Sydney. And he said, I'm buying something in Balcombe Hills and I'm looking at, particular apartments. And I said, no, go for townhouses. And he's like, why? It's the same price. And I was like, well, you would see the price difference is relatively similar. Yes, the apartment is brand new, but the townhouse is slightly old, but you would see more appreciation coming through townhouses.
Yeah.
And, fast forward like 6-7 years now, you see that, coming through, right? He bought a townhouse, I think, for like $530 or $540 at that time, probably like $1 million worth right now. Just that, because there is a piece of land attached to it.
And like you said, in those areas where there's an oversupply of apartments, whereas there's not as many townhouses, and because townhouses tend to typically be in a bit more sort of boutique blocks, you can get townhouses with 20, 30, 40, but then they're boutique blocks. They're not as expensive as the house, but yet some people don't need something as large as a house with the garden and all that, and they actually are drawn to more townhouses because they are lower maintenance as well. So there is more of that likelihood of that equity growth and capital growth, but still not as bad a yield as a house. So it's your real in between. But again, the thing to be aware of is your strata fees that are attached to it. They may not be as high as your apartments, but they're still okay.
I think one of the notions that people talk about, and I've heard this in a podcast just recently, was this person particularly saying that, okay, Australian population is growing up so fast and the price discrepancy between houses and units is massive. And so naturally the units are going to grow up in value. It cannot be that units don't grow up in value because the house prices would be so far-fetched. Let's look at some of the stats, right? So you go back, you take yourself back maybe 20, 30 years ago, and the house prices were 3 times the salary. Right now, it's like 8 times the salary and average, family income, basically. So massive disparity. And so, of course, the unit prices or the townhouses needs to go up in value to match that, because people wouldn't be able to afford it. And naturally, the default position would be, we'll just go out and buy units and buy apartments. My question always is that, yes, that's true. And no one can deny that the population growth would basically impact and you would see the growth coming through. The question is, how long do you have to wait for some of these impacts to come through? And so it's not a universal rule that apartments would grow up in value or townhouses would grow up in value. Go start buying them in Townsville or Cairns. It's almost like that every suburb has a market on its own, and you need to identify whether that cycle of townhouses or apartments is happening in that suburb right now or not. And so if you're buying a property for $300,000, you can't just default and say, I'm going to buy a unit in Townsville because if it's going to grow in value. Yes, but you might have to wait 30 years for that to happen. You need to be as close to the growth curve as possible. And so it's not so much about buying a unit and waiting for it, because the market needs, sometimes, you need to think about the short and the medium term growth as well. And that's why picking up the right asset class is quite important.
Yeah.
The cheapies not always tick all the boxes.
Yeah. And we've seen, townhouses in some lower cost areas, which, because they are so affordable, have gone up immensely in capital growth as well.
Definitely.
I'd say if you were to choose between a townhouse and an apartment, and for whatever reason you can't buy a house, then I dare say the townhouse is a better option.
100%.
Again,
definitely.
As you can tell, the land value is essentially what it is that we want to be focusing on, because that's the part that actually increases in value.
Yeah. My rule of thumb is that if there is massive demand for people looking to buy in a particular suburb, and there is a price discrepancy of more than 25% between a townhouse and a house, then the townhouse would basically go up to meet that requirement, and it would basically shrink the gap to almost like 15%. And so areas where the price discrepancy is more than 25, 30, 35%, I've seen areas like 40% price discrepancy, especially in Adelaide. Like you would see apartments or you would see townhouses selling for like 650 or 700, and you would see houses selling for like 1.2, 1.3 million. In those areas where the demand is seriously high, you would see about, these townhouses doing significantly well because of that affordability that comes into play. And that's what you're referring to. Yeah,
absolutely. So to wrap up, Moss, to be or not to be apartments?
Look, as a non-emotional investor, I have done both and I have lost money in both. I was never good at picking up the right apartments. Probably now I would consider it, but as a general rule, I would always say to people, look, stay away from apartments, stay away from townhouses, unless your budget is too tight. And then even then, either educate yourself to pick the right, investor grade product in even the apartment space or the unit space, or seek help, because these are some of the asset classes where you can make a mistake quite easily. Anyone can sell you a dart quite quickly, and you would think, I'm just buying a $220,000 property and it's renting for $470. That's great. But that $220 remains $220 for the next 10 years, and it's not so great anymore.
Yeah, exactly. So apartment.
What about you?
I think you have so much choice now in terms of where, you can buy outside of your major cities. There are other places.
Definitely.
There are good investment grade suburbs all across Australia. And I feel that there are other options. There are other options there.
Definitely.
Unless you really, unless it's a needle in the haystack where it's, right on the top of Sydney Harbour, and there's no one else that's around you, and there's a boutique block of 10, that's the price sitting there, almost glowing in the dark.
Yeah.
And you can add value to it, and it'll turn over, 10 times. I'd say those would be the key things I'd look for if I didn't have any other choice. But
definitely,
we dare, I say we have plenty of choice.
Definitely.
So yeah,
that's an amazing wrap up. I think it all comes down to choices. So don't feel that at different price points that you have available, you don't have a choice. Ultimately, the stateless investing that is happening right now, you can buy properties with land component for as low as $300,000 or $250,000. So if you have the choice with the land component attached to it, where the demand is high and supply is low, why would you not go down that path? Also, be smart about this, right? Use LMI to your advantage to do a better asset class selection. It's not so much about the deposit. It's about being smart about how do you enter into some of these investment strategies.
Yeah.
If you have your experiences for apartments and townhouses and, you feel that, you haven't covered some of these points, feel free to jump into the comments and share some of those stories. Ping me or Cheryl, and we can bring you in and talk a bit about your stories as well.
Yeah.
Till then, be kind, stay safe, keep smiling, take care. This is Moss and Cheryl checking out. Adios.